Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to give you some ideas about why you might want to dehydrate frozen vegetables, and I'll also demonstrate how to dehydrate frozen corn. I'm Rebecca from Simple Suburban Living. First, let's talk about why you might want to dehydrate frozen vegetables. Number one, you don't have a garden. For instance, if you live in a city, you may not have room for a garden. You might be in an apartment or townhouse, or perhaps in a house with a small yard. Or it's possible you have room for a garden, but in this particular season of life, you don't have time for a garden, or you may have other limitations that make it difficult to garden. If you've ever watched food preservation videos from other people that have gardens and they use canning and dehydrating to preserve the fruits of their garden and you felt left out, it's great to know that you don't have to grow your own fruit and vegetables to preserve food. You can preserve food that you purchased at the grocery store, and dehydrating frozen fruit and vegetables is one way to go about that. Number two, you may have a garden, but you don't grow all of the types of produce that you want to preserve. Dehydrating food from the freezer section of your store is one way to expand the variety of food you preserve. For instance, here's a glimpse of the frozen vegetable options at my local Walmart. Now, something that's not there in this video are fajita veggies, and I've seen them there before. They're green and red bell peppers and onions, and so I'm sure they're just out of them right now, but it would be great to dehydrate those so you can have them on hand anytime you want to make fajitas. They do currently have stir-fry vegetables, and having some in your pantry anytime you're in the mood for stir-fry is a great thing. And of course, they have the typical options like corn, green beans, mixed vegetables, and so on. Number three, dehydrating frozen vegetables is easy and requires no real prep time. As you'll see in a bit as I demonstrate this, all you have to do is dump the vegetables onto the dehydrator trays and plug it in. No chopping, blanching, or other prep that you may need to do with fresh produce. Number four, dehydrating frozen fruit and vegetables frees up freezer space. If you've ever struggled with fitting everything into your freezer, you know how valuable freezer space can be. Since frozen vegetables are easy to dehydrate, it can be nice to reserve your freezer space for things that you may not want to dehydrate, such as meat. Number five, speaking of freezer space, assuming you have space in your freezer, you can keep the frozen vegetables in the freezer until you have time to dehydrate them. Now, this is an advantage over fresh produce that you need to do something with fairly soon after harvesting or purchasing. Now, it is true that you can put fresh vegetables into the freezer until you're ready to process them, but you may still want to cut them up or do something else with them before freezing. Now that you know some of the benefits of dehydrating frozen vegetables, let's get into how to dehydrate frozen corn. I'm going to show you the process that I use, let you know how long it took to dehydrate the frozen corn, and I'll also show you how to rehydrate it and what it looks like after rehydrating. But first, if you want to be notified when I publish more videos on dehydrating, canning, gardening, and small areas or other simple living topics, be sure to subscribe to my channel and click on the bell so you'll be notified every time I publish new content. All right, now let's get into how to dehydrate frozen corn. It's super simple. So first, you just dump the corn onto your dehydrator trays. You don't have to thaw it first if you don't want to, but the process is slightly different depending on whether or not the vegetables are thawed. And I'll explain that difference to you in just a moment. Depending on the type of vegetables that you're dehydrating, you may or may not need to use one of these screens. Since corn is small, I'm going to use the screens because otherwise the corn will fall right through the holes in the tray. Now, ideally, you'll put your vegetables in a single layer, but depending on the amount of vegetables you're dehydrating and the amount of trays you have, you may need to overlap them. And that's okay, it'll just take a bit longer. The bottom line is to equally distribute the frozen corn or whatever other vegetable you're dehydrating on your trays and spread it out as much as possible. Now, if you're starting with frozen vegetables that you haven't thawed, run the dehydrator at 145 degrees for the first 2 hours. You can then reduce the temperature to 125 degrees. If you're starting with thawed vegetables, you can set the temperature to 125 degrees and not change it at all. So I've already put all of the corn onto the trays, and I've set the timer for 2 hours. And then I'll check to see how they're doing, and I'll update you at that time. So 2 hours have passed, and here's what the corn looks like. You can see that some of the corn is partially dry, but there's still a lot of moisture. Now I'm reducing the temperature to 125 degrees, and I'll check on the corn in a couple of hours. By the way, if you're ever tempted to dehydrate things at a higher temperature, thinking that it'll make things go faster, don't. I'm going to put a link in the description for an excellent article on dehydrating food that I found on Fresh Off the Grid. The key part of the article that I want to point out here is that if you dehydrate at too high of a temperature, you can run the risk of causing bacterial growth. So don't crank up the temperature with the hopes that you'll get the job done faster. All right, now the 2 hours has gone by, and I checked the corn again, and here's what it looks like after the first 4 hours. Now remember that the first 2 hours were at 145 degrees, and the second 2 hours were at 125 degrees. You can see that the corn is almost completely dry, but if anything, with dehydrating, I like to err on the side of caution, so I'm going to let it go for 2 more hours. It's now been a total of 6 hours, and the corn is completely dehydrated. So there are a couple more things that I want to show you. First, let's talk about how much dehydrating shrunk the corn. I started with these 2-quart jars of frozen corn. You can see that they're not completely full, but close. Now that it's dehydrated, you can see how much less it is. The reduction in volume is one of the things I love most about dehydrating. You can stock a lot more food in a small space if you dehydrate, compared to the space canning or freezing takes. Now let's look at the process of rehydrating the corn and what it looks like after rehydrating. I reserved a tablespoon of the frozen corn so that we can do a direct comparison. I'm taking about a half a tablespoon of the dehydrated corn and covering it with some very hot water. And it took about 5 minutes to plump up. Here's what it looks like compared to the thawed frozen corn. The thawed frozen corn is on the left, and the rehydrated corn is on the right. As you can see, there is very little difference between the frozen corn that has been thawed and the rehydrated corn. Now, I've served the rehydrated corn to my family many times without them ever noticing that I started with dehydrated corn. I have also had great success with dumping the dehydrated corn into soups and stews, and it's turned out great. Also, as strange as it may sound, I like munching on the dehydrated corn. It's sweet and crunchy, and I love it combined with something like raisins or craisins. So I hope that you'll give dehydrating frozen vegetables a try. They really are fun and easy to do, and the results are excellent. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to leave them below. And let me know if you plan to dehydrate frozen vegetables, or perhaps if you've already tried it, you can share your experience with the rest of us. And of course, I'd love it if you'd like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and of course, click on the little notification bell so you'll be notified each time I publish new videos. Thank you so much, and happy dehydrating!